Hey guys, tonight, we re-talking about something that doesn't sound particularly cozy, a bitter powder that tastes like regret, built empires, and accidentally shaped global history. So, yeah, perfect bedtime material. Go ahead, dim the lights, maybe grab a drink. If it's tonic water, even better. That's right, the very same drink that glows under black light and pairs with gin also has its roots in colonial conquest, death by mosquito, and a lot of desperate Europeans sweating in the tropics. We re-talking about quinine, the drug that basically kept European imperialism alive long enough to ruin half the planet. But don't worry, we'll drift through it slowly. Let's begin somewhere warm and humid and full of buzzing insects carrying death in their tiny annoying bodies. The world before quinine, malaria wasn't just a disease, it was a way of life, a very short, feverish life. Ancient people didn't really know what it was, but they knew it was bad. The Greeks called it bad air, or malaria, which is where the name stuck, because, sure, blame the air. The Roman Empire dealt with it constantly. In fact, the swamps around Rome were basically mosquito spas. Emperors, senators, peasants, didn't matter. Everyone got it. Whole regions of Italy were considered unlivable because of it, but malaria didn't stay in Rome. It loved to travel. It followed armies, traders, and eventually colonial explorers like an uninvited groupie that just won't leave. By the 1600s, it had become a serious problem for Europeans trying to explore and exploit the New World. The tropics were filled with resources, gold, silver, spices, land, people to enslave, you name it. But they were also filled with mosquitoes, which made sure that every expedition was also a slow-motion death march. And then, somehow, salvation came not from European science, but from indigenous knowledge in South America, which, naturally, Europeans would later take full credit for. The tree that cured death. In the highlands of Peru and Ecuador, the Quechua people knew of a magical tree. Its bark could cure fevers. They called it quinine, meaning bark of barks. It was bitter, almost undrinkably so, but it worked. When Jesuit missionaries arrived in the Andes in the early 1600s, they noticed local healers using the bark to treat shivering fevers. The Jesuits, not exactly known for their medical innovation, but very good at noticing things, took some of the powder back to Europe, and that's where the myth begins. According to one story, the Countess of Chinchon, wife of the Spanish Viceroy of Peru, was cured of malaria by the bark in 1638. She was so grateful that she supposedly brought the medicine back to Spain. From her name came cinchona, the genus name of the tree. The story is almost certainly fake, but it was romantic, so it stuck because Europeans love a good noblewoman's safe-to-be-nature narrative. What isn't fake, though, is what happened next. Jesuits began exporting the bark, and by the 1640s, Jesuits' powder was the hottest medical trend in Europe. Well, hot for the time, meaning it took a few decades and several church bans before people accepted it, church-approved or devil's work. Not everyone was thrilled about a Catholic cure. In Protestant countries like England and Holland, anything associated with Jesuits was immediately suspicious. The British were convinced it was a papist plot, that somehow, the bark would secretly convert them to Catholicism or kill them outright. Medicine and religion were not good teammates back then. So, while Catholics were living fever-free, Protestants were still dying with their moral superiority intact. Eventually, reality won. Even Oliver Cromwell, England's grim military dictator, reportedly refused quinine because of its Catholic ties and promptly died of malaria. Poetic, really. By the 1700s, quinine had become a staple of European medicine. It wasn't perfect, people still had no idea how malaria actually worked, but it was the only thing that consistently helped. So now with this magical bark, Europeans had a weapon against one of the deadliest diseases on Earth. Naturally, they used it to colonize the rest of it. The empire's favorite drink. Fast forward to the 1800s, the British Empire is doing what it does best, invading tropical countries, pretending it's for trade, and dying of malaria while doing it. Africa, in particular, was known as the white man's grave. For every settler who arrived, several stayed permanently. Then came quinine, now purified into a fine, white powder. It didn't taste any better. In fact, it was famously awful, but soldiers were told to take it daily, mixed into water. Eventually, someone had a brilliant idea. If we add gin, it might go down easier. And thus, the gin and tonic was born, the unofficial drink of colonialism. A refreshing way to ignore the moral rot of empire while pretending you were just fighting mosquitoes. The British took it everywhere: India, Africa, the Caribbean. Quinine became as essential to their global operations as gunpowder and arrogance. Of course, the quinine didn't come from Britain, it came from trees, and those trees grew only in South America. So now, Europe needed to control the source. The race for the bark. By the mid-1800s, the cinchona tree had become the world's most valuable plant. Every empire wanted it. Every empire wanted to grow it. The Spanish tried to keep the seeds secret. They even banned exportation of the trees. But, as history has shown, banning something just makes Europeans steal it faster. Enter a Scottish botanist named Charles Ledger. He bribed a local farmer in Bolivia to smuggle out some seeds. Those seeds ended up in the hands of the Dutch, who planted them in Java, modern-day Indonesia. And just like that, the Dutch created a global monopoly on quinine production. For decades, Java's plantations supplied most of the world's supply. It was a brilliant economic move, though not great for the local environment or the workers, who weren't exactly volunteering to harvest bark all day. Quinine and war. Quinine didn't just save empires, it fought wars for them. During the building of the Panama Canal, for example, malaria was killing workers by the thousands. French engineers tried and failed. Then the Americans came in with barrels of quinine and gallons of mosquito oil and somehow managed to finish it. Even in World War II, quinine was still crucial. When Japan captured Java in 1942, the Allies suddenly lost their main supply. So, scientists scrambled to make synthetic versions, which is how we got chloroquine, mefloquine, and eventually hydroxychloroquine, the pandemic-era celebrity drug. Yes, the same bitter molecule that saved empires also accidentally helped create one of the internet's weirdest medical debates centuries later. History, it seems, loves a sequel. So, we left off with Europeans finally figuring out how to colonize the tropics without immediately dying of malaria, thanks to quinine. Which means, of course, things were about to get much worse for everyone else. Let's drift back into the 1800s, the golden age of empire building and moral hypocrisy. Britain, France, and the Netherlands were racing to see who could collect the most colonies. Like bored rich kids comparing trading cards, and quinine made it possible. Before quinine, large parts of Africa were no-go zones for Europeans. Too deadly, too hot, too full of mosquitoes. After quinine, suddenly, the same officers who once fainted in the shade of Gibraltar were marching confidently through West Africa, tonic bottles in hand. They called it the medical shield of empire, which sounds noble until you realize it was less about saving lives and more about conquering land. Quinine and the scramble for Africa. By the late 19th century, every European nation with a map and a mustache wanted a slice of Africa. They held the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, the most polite meeting ever held to divide other people's land. And behind all the flags, maps, and civilizing missions, there was quinine. Without it, the scramble for Africa might have been more of a slow, feverish crawl. Take the British in West Africa, for example. Before quinine, they lost about 70% of their troops to malaria every year. After they made quinine part of the daily ration, deaths dropped dramatically. Soldiers still hated taking it. They said it tasted like ground-up pennies soaked in despair. But it kept them alive long enough to establish colonial rule. Meanwhile, local people were watching these pale, sunburned invaders suddenly survive tropical climates and thinking, oh no, they've found something. And they had the Dutch quinine empire. While Britain was busy building political empires, the Dutch were quietly running a botanical one. Their cinchona plantations in Java became the global source of quinine. The conditions weren't exactly paradise. The workers, mostly Javanese laborers, harvested bark under strict colonial oversight. The Dutch profited massively, controlling up to 90% of the world's quinine supply. And because quinine was so essential for any colonial power, this gave the Dutch incredible leverage. You couldn't fight malaria without them. It was like controlling oil, but for not dying. By the early 1900s, the quinine trade was one of the most valuable industries in the world. Every capsule, every tonic, every dose that made it possible for Europeans to occupy tropical lands came from those trees, and all of it traced back to the stolen seeds of one tree in the Andes. Medicine, myth, and marketing. As quinine became mainstream, it started showing up everywhere, not just in medicine but in tonics, wines, and even candies. Europeans loved to disguise it, because, again, it was disgusting. The taste is so bitter that your tongue practically recoils in protest, so they mixed it with sugar, lemon, alcohol, or all three. The 19th century saw the birth of tonic wines, essentially fortified alcohol marketed as health drinks. The most famous was Vin Mariani, a French wine infused with coca leaves and quinine. Yes, that means people were casually sipping on a mix of alcohol, cocaine, and malaria medicine for wellness. It was even endorsed by popes. 3 of them, actually. Because, if history has taught us anything, it's that the Catholic Church will absolutely bless a product if it tastes fancy enough. The civilizing mission. Sponsored by science with malaria under control, European explorers declared themselves the bringers of civilization. The narrative was simple. Science had triumphed over savage nature, and now it was time to share progress with the world, usually at gunpoint. Quinine became part of that mythology. It symbolized not just survival, but superiority. Europeans could now live where locals had lived for millennia, and that, to them, was proof of divine favor. Of course, they conveniently ignored that indigenous peoples had discovered quinine in the first place. The Quechua healers who first used the bark were erased from the story. In the European version, the miracle started only when a Spanish countess got a fever. That's how empire works. It doesn't just conquer land, it rewrites the credits. Science catches up for centuries. No one really understood why quinine worked, it just did. Then, in 1880, a French army doctor named Alphonse Levarin looked under his microscope and saw something wiggling inside a malaria patient's blood. It was the malaria parasite, the real culprit. A few years later, British doctor Ronald Ross discovered that mosquitoes were spreading it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The bad air theory was dead. With this knowledge, public health programs began to focus not only on treatment, but prevention, draining swamps, using nets, and of course, dosing everyone with quinine. The empire now had both science and medicine on its side, a deadly combination, depending on which side of the empire you lived on. The glow of modernity. By the early 20th century, quinine had become a symbol of modern medicine, clean, scientific, and civilized. Even the glow of tonic water under ultraviolet light became a kind of scientific novelty. You could sit in a colonial club in India, sip your gin and tonic, and feel like part of progress, even if you were sitting on stolen land, drinking the byproduct of stolen trees protected by a drug discovered by people your empire had conquered. History, as usual, tastes a bit bitter. So, we've wandered through jungles, plantations, and colonial dining clubs. Quinine was everywhere in medicine chests, soldier rations, and the evening drinks of people pretending to be civilizing the world. But empires don't stay stable forever. By the early 20th century, scientists started wondering, what if we didn't have to strip bark off trees on the other side of the world, just to stop shaking and sweating? What if we could make quinine in a lab? That question would start a chemical arms race, one that mixed medicine, money, and a bit of hubris. The dream of artificial quinine had started in Germany. Because of course it did. Germany at the time was the world's chemistry powerhouse, the same country that figured out how to make synthetic dyes, aspirin, and, eventually, some less pleasant things. In 1856, a young chemist named William Henry Perkin accidentally created the first synthetic dye, movine, while trying to make quinine. He failed miserably at curing malaria, but succeeded at inventing purple fashion. It was a win for dresses, not for fevers. Still, the idea of making quinine artificially stuck around. For decades, chemists tried to replicate the molecule and failed. Quinine's structure is ridiculously complicated, with more twists and turns than a royal family tree. It wasn't until 1944 that American chemists finally managed to synthesize it. By then, of course, the world had gone completely insane with war, and quinine had become a strategic resource again. World War II and the quinine crisis. When Japan occupied the Dutch East Indies in 1942, it cut off the Allies' access to Java's cinchona plantations. Suddenly, there wasn't enough quinine to go around. Malaria hit the Allied troops hard, especially in the Pacific. Some divisions had more soldiers out with fever than from enemy bullets. The US and Britain scrambled to find alternatives. That's when synthetic substitutes like chloroquine and attabrini came into play. They weren't perfect. Attabrini, for example, turned soldiers' skin a weird yellow color, but they worked well enough. It was wartime pragmatism at its finest. If the drug makes you look like a Simpsons character but keeps you alive, that's good enough. Meanwhile, the Axis powers were also desperate. German chemists had their own synthetic drugs, though not nearly as effective. Ironically, the country that had spent decades trying to make artificial quinine still couldn't make enough of it when it really mattered. Post-war medicine and the fall of the bark after the war, synthetic anti-malarials took over. Chloroquine became the new standard. It was cheaper, easier to make, and didn't depend on colonial plantations. For the first time in centuries, the world started moving away from the cinchona tree. Java's quinine industry declined. The Dutch monopoly evaporated, and with that, one of the longest-running colonial cash crops quietly faded into history. But the story doesn't end there, because malaria wasn't done with humanity, not even close. The war that never ended. By the 1960s, malaria control programs were at their peak. DDT was the numerical chemical, spraying its way across continents. People genuinely believed malaria could be wiped out forever. And for a while, it almost worked in some places. But then the mosquitoes adapted, the parasites adapted, chloroquine resistance spread, and suddenly everyone missed the old days of bitter, natural quinine. The ancient cure was making a comeback. Today, in parts of the world where malaria is still endemic, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of South America, quinine is still used when other drugs fail. It's not the first line of defense anymore, but it's the old friend doctors call when nothing else works. 400 years later, the bark of barks is still saving lives. The cocktail that outlived an empire. Let's float back to something lighter. Literally lighter, glowing, actually. Tonic water, the modern descendant of all this history. The original British tonic was so packed with quinine it could almost count as medicine. Modern versions, not so much. There's barely enough quinine in your G&T to notice unless you shine a blacklight on it and admire that soft blue glow. That glow is the molecule's way of saying, I once fought colonial fevers, and now I'm just here for vibes. Every sip of tonic water today is a faint echo of empire, a reminder that a global medical revolution was born out of bitter bark and a lot of questionable decision-making. The long shadow of the bitter cure. Quinine's story is a strange one. It began with indigenous healers in the Andes. It became the weapon that fueled colonial expansion. It saved millions, exploited millions more, and changed the way humanity spread across the planet. It's hard to find another medicine so tangled up with conquest, survival, and irony. Without quinine, there might have been no age of empire as we know it. Africa and Asia might have stayed, at least for a while, beyond the reach of European domination. The world map could have looked completely different. Instead, a few grains of bitter powder made global domination possible, all because someone, somewhere, decided to trust the wisdom of a local healer with some tree bark, a bitter end. So the next time you sip a gin and tonic, or see that faint glow in your glass, remember what you're really tasting. You're drinking history, colonial, medicinal, and deeply ironic, a trace of the bark that changed the world. From the Andes to Java to your cocktail glass, quinine's journey has been long, dark, and quietly revolutionary. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, just think all of this began with a fever, a forest, and a little bitter tree that refused to be forgotten. So, you're still here, still awake, or maybe drifting somewhere between the Andes and a gin glass. That's fine. Tonight we're wrapping up the strange, slow afterlife of quinine, the drug that helped conquer continents and now mostly hides in supermarket mixes. Because even after the empire faded, quinine didn't disappear. It just reinvented itself quietly, like an old politician who becomes a talk show guest. From medicine to marketing, by the mid-20th century, quinine's medical fame had dimmed, but its name lingered everywhere. Tonic water had gone from being a military ration to a middle-class habit. It wasn't about malaria anymore, it was about taste. That bitter snap people once forced down for survival became refreshing once it was optional. There's something very human about that. We hate a medicine until we can buy it in a fancy bottle. Companies like Schweppes and Canada Dry turned quinine into a lifestyle. Their ads promised crisp refreshment, not less chance of dying in the tropics. You could almost forget that every glass carried a faint trace of colonial history, and that the word tonic once meant dainty dye. By the 1960s, most people drinking tonic water had never heard of cinchona bark. They just liked the fizz, the ghost in the laboratory still. Chemists never fully let go of quinine. It's too interesting. Its molecule, twisty, asymmetric, annoyingly complex, became a classic in chemistry textbooks. Students still study it to learn about stereochemistry, the branch that deals with how molecules have left and right hands. Quinine is like nature's Rubik's Cube, simple at a glance, maddening up close. And despite newer, cleaner drugs, quinine stayed in the medical toolkit. Doctors used it for leg cramps, nocturnal muscle spasms, and, briefly, in experimental treatments. It's one of those old remedies that never completely leaves the pharmacy shelf, just moves lower down. A strange modern revival then came the 21st century, where everything old becomes a headline again. During the COVID-19 pandemic, an old cousin of quinine, hydroxychloroquine, suddenly became the most controversial molecule on the internet. People debated it on talk shows, politicians swore by it, and pharmacies ran out. Few realized they were watching the great-great-grandchild of the same bark that once saved European armies. The irony was thick enough to stir into a cocktail. For centuries after Jesuits carried powdered bark across the Atlantic, the world was still arguing about whether a quinine derivative could save humanity. Some things never change, especially confusion. The science of glow. Let's drift to something gentler. The glow. If you've ever seen tonic water under a black light, you know it shines an eerie blue. That glow comes from quinine's natural fluorescence. It absorbs ultraviolet light and re-emits it at a visible wavelength, like a tiny chemistry magic trick. In the 19th century, that glow fascinated physicists. They used quinine solutions to study the behavior of light, experiments that eventually fed into quantum theory. So, in a small way, quinine didn't just fight malaria, it helped shape modern physics. Not bad for tree bark. The places that remember today, the cinchona tree still grows in the Andes, though not in the wild abundance it once had. Some replanting efforts exist, partly for nostalgia, partly for heritage. In Peru, the tree appears on the national coat of arms, a quiet nod to the fact that the country's greatest global export wasn't tea, silver, or gold, but medicine. Meanwhile, in old colonial museums, you'll find dusty displays about quinine production, glass jars of bark, faded maps of Java, and photos of sunburned European planters looking very pleased with themselves. The captions usually call it a triumph of science, which is one way to describe theft with good branding. The irony of the gin and tonic few drinks carries such a strange backstory. The gin came from Britain's love of juniper and self-medicating sailors. The tonic came from desperation in the colonies. Together they became the taste of victory, and eventually, just the taste of summer. Modern bars often add cucumber slices or artisanal ice, not realizing the drink's original recipe included malaria pills. The bitter flavor once meant survival. Now it means refreshing with hints of citrus. That shift says a lot about history. We soften what once hurt. We turn suffering into aesthetics. We take a medicinal bark that built empires, and we garnish it with a lime wedge. The bitter lesson quinine's story isn't just about medicine, it's about how knowledge travels. The Quechua discovered it. The Jesuits marketed it. The empires industrialized it. And the world, somehow, turned it into a drink. It's a cycle as old as history itself. Discovery, exploitation, forgetting, nostalgia. If you trace any modern convenience far enough back, you usually end up at a story like this where something natural, local and sacred becomes global, profitable, and blandly commercial. Quinine just happens to taste exactly like that process. The sleepy epilogue. So, here we are for centuries after a bitter tree in the Andes first changed human destiny. The empires are gone, the plantations overgrown, and malaria still stubbornly exists. But the bark remains, both literally and symbolically. It taught humans how to fight nature, and in doing so, how to exploit it. It cured millions, enabled conquest, inspired science, and became the flavor of relaxation. A strange resume for a bit of bark, so the next time someone offers you a gin and tonic, you can nod quietly, take a sip and think, this tastes like empire, medicine, and maybe, just maybe, progress. Then let that thought dissolve. As the ice melts, the bitterness fades and history drifts back into sleep. Hey, again. If you're still here, you've outlasted for centuries of fever and empire. Most explorers never made it this far, so well done. Now we at the quiet end of the story, the part where everything slows down and the world finally exhales. The bark that never left quinine was supposed to be just a cure for a bad night's sweat, but it grew into something far larger, a cornerstone of empire, a symbol of science, and finally a flavor in a drink. Up in the Andes, a few cinchona trees still stand, their bark still bitter, their leaves still whispering the same secret the Quechua healers knew centuries ago. Nature usually had the answer before we bothered to ask. What history leaves behind, the quinine story is really about how people handle power. Someone discovers, someone else claims, everyone else pays. It's the same rhythm behind sugar, coffee, rubber, and gold. The names change, the melody stays, and yet, the knowledge survived. The bark was taken and renamed, but never erased. It lingers, like an old note that refuses to fade. The echo in the glass picture, a bar, dim light, a faint hum of conversation, a glass clinks. That glow in the tonic is history pretending to be ambience. No one thinks about malaria, plantations, or Jesuit powders anymore. They just sip. That's how history hides in habits, in taste, in what feels normal. The empire's medicine has become your nightcap. The small, bitter truth: malaria still kills hundreds of thousands each year, mostly in the same regions once civilized by empire. The cure that built fortunes is now just another commodity on a pharmacy shelf. Progress doesn't erase the past, it just changes the label. They fade out so as you drift off. Imagine that bark again peeled from a quiet tree, ground to dust, carried across oceans. It saved lives, fueled conquest, inspired chemistry, and now glows faintly in your drink. Not bad for a tree that wanted nothing from us at all. Sleep well, and remember, history doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just murmurs in the dark, faintly bitter, quietly true. Good night. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check. The world thought it had one. In the mid-20th century, with DDT sprays and synthetic drugs, malaria cases plummeted. Entire continents declared victory. Then the mosquitoes adapted, the parasite evolved, the fever came back, the disease that quinine once tamed learned new tricks. By the 1980s, resistance spread across Africa and Asia. The old cure stopped working. Scientists scrambled again, chasing new molecules the way empires once chased new colonies. Artemisinin, another plant-based compound from sweet wormwood, replaced quinine as the modern hero. But even now, resistance shadows it too. It's a reminder that nature doesn't play by our timelines from miracle to memory. Today, quinine barely features in medicine. It's used for muscle cramps more than malaria. But in a strange twist, its legacy lives stronger in culture than in health. Every tonic bottle, every glowing bar glass, every tiny fizzing bubble carries a trace of empire, discovery, and human stubbornness. Even the name tonic came from the promise of vitality, a little colonial optimism, bottled and carbonated. The irony of progress: we replaced bark with pills, colonies with corporations, explorers with chemists, different uniforms, same instinct: find, extract, profit, move on. But progress isn't the villain. It's the mirror. Quinine shows how curiosity and cruelty often travel side by side. The same spark that drives a botanist to isolate an alkaloid can drive a merchant to exploit a continent. A soft return to the forest. Imagine, for a moment, that we're back in the Andes. Mist curls through the branches. The forest hums. Somewhere, a cinchona tree stands unbothered. It doesn't know about empires or cocktails. It just grows, slow and steady, full of quiet power. A leaf drops, lands in the wet soil, and starts again. The forest doesn't remember names, it just remembers balance. The lesson in the bitter bark may be that what quinine's history was trying to say all along. That the cure is never just chemical, it's humility. Listening, we learned to fight the fever. But we still haven't learned to stop repeating it in different forms, with different names. The bark is bitter for a reason. It reminds us not to forget, and that's it. The story of a tree that cured kings and killed empires, that glows in the glass and hums in the bloodstream of history. When the world gets loud, think of the cinchona still standing somewhere, older than the map that once carved it up. Sleep now, let the bitterness fade. Let the forest breathe.